makers, I'm Katherine from Minerva, and today I wanted to share with you a sew along on the Bruyere shirt, which happens to be the pattern from one of our latest Minerva kits. Now, don't forget to follow hashtag Minerva kits so you can catch all of the new kits when we release them. So first I wanted to chat a little bit about the Bruyere shirt. So it is a pattern from Doe Patterns and comes in a variety of sizes from size 34 through to 46, and that is a 31.5-inch bust through to a 41-inch bust, and a 23.5-inch waist through to a 33-inch waist, and a 33.75-inch hip through to a 43.25 hip. Now, there is a little bit of ease built into this shirt, which makes it extra comfortable to wear. So you have about 3 inches or so around each of the bust and waist measurements, and a lot more in the hips because it does come in and flare out at the end. So unlike a traditional men's dress shirt or most other women's dress shirts, this one actually has a very sort of fit and flare fit to the garment itself. So though it does have a looser fit, so it's comfortable, it really cinches in that waist and then flares out at the hips and does come a little bit longer. Now this gives a really nice feminine silhouette to this shirt, and I would imagine would be incredibly well for hacking this pattern if you wanted to turn it into a dress. Now, if you're ordering one of the kits, all you have to do is add on a couple extra meters of fabric, maybe half a meter, depending on what type of a skirt you're going to make for it, and I think it would turn out absolutely beautiful. Now, this shirt has a couple of different options. So you have the full regular sleeve option, which I have done here, but there's also an option to do a sleeveless version for this as well. And in our kits, we also have a variety of different fabrics that you can choose from to really customize your specific style. So let's get into that tutorial.
Let it go, what's the use in holding on? Can we find a way where we could spend some time alone? You know where to find me, you know which way to go. As long as you love me, we'll be singing all night long. So take a minute to hold me. I want nothing.
So before we begin, we need to gather up all of our supplies. Now, if you ordered the kit, this is what is included. So we're going to start off with our fabric, and we're going to need about 2.5 meters of the fabric. And what I would suggest doing is pre-washing this fabric in the way in which you are going to launder your garment when it is done. So I pop mine in the washing machine as well as the dryer just to pre-shrink anything. Then I pressed it all out and got it ready on this bolt so that I could cut it out. Next up, we have a paper pattern, and the nice thing about the Doe patterns is it comes in both French as well as English instructions. Next up, we have a package of fusible interfacing included so that we can do the cuffs as well as the collar, and you'll have plenty of leftover. Next up, we have some bias binding. Now this is used for view B, which is the sleeveless option, but it's also great to have some bias binding in our stash so that if you ever need it, it's there for you. Next up, we have some buttons, and you are going to need 12 buttons in total, so you get 2 packages of that. Next up, it comes with some matching thread to whichever fabric selection that you chose. And last but not least, we have a 70-10 universal needle, which is perfect for sewing this up. And fun fact, you want to change your sewing needle about every 8 hours of sewing, or on average with every project. So let's get into cutting and sewing it out. So the first thing that I like to do, especially with paper patterns, is trace it out so that I still have all of the sizes available should I change sizes later on, or I want to make this as a gift for someone else. That being said, if you want, you can always cut into that pattern as well. There are a couple of things that I added to the pattern pieces that weren't included on the printed version here. I included adding the cut notes for the interfacing on both the sleeves as well as the collar pieces because it's not noted on the pattern pieces. And I like to cut this out all at the same time. That being said, you could follow the instructions and cut it out at a later step. I just find this way to be a little bit more streamlined. So do whichever works best for you. That being said, since we have that cut out, I wanted to mention that we can also fuse our interfacing to our cuffs as well as our collar pieces. Now in the instructions, it does mention that you are to fuse both sides of the collar with interfacing. I wanted a little less stiff of a collar because I want this to be a relaxed shirt. So I decided to only use one layer of interfacing on the underside of my collar as opposed to two, but really that's up to you as well. So let's get sewing. So step one, the bodice. So we're going to begin by transferring our markings to the wrong side of our fabric. Don't forget to add in those two little notches which denote the back of the sleeve notches. We're going to start by drawing out the legs of our dart, just using some tailor's chalk and a ruler. So you want to match the ruler at the top point there and then match it all the way down to the bottom leg of the dart. And you're going to do that for all of the darts on your shirt here. So once that is all done, we need to attach the back yoke pieces together. So we've got the top and the bottom of the back of our shirt. So with this, I am going to turn this right sides together and then just pin, making sure that everything is distributed nice and evenly. And then from there, you are going to stitch. So fill up your thread and bobbin and switch out your needle. So the seam allowance on this pattern is 5/8 of an inch. So you're going to start and end your seams with a back stitch, and I just moved my needle over to get that seam allowance. Next, we want to press that seam going up towards the top. So we are just pressing this down nicely, and then we are going to go and put the top of the dart, we're going to place a pin in it, and then we're going to place a pin in the bottom of the dart and then fold it together. Now you want to make sure that your pins point down towards the bottom of the dart and not the point, because we are going to be stitching from the bottom of the dart going up towards the point. And I am just checking to make sure that the back of my pins line up along the line on the back end. So we're going to start by placing our needle down right along that chalk line we drew and back stitching. And then we are just going to stitch going up the leg of the dart. Do not back stitch when you get to the end. Just take your needle up and then leave a nice long tail. And then from there, we are going to knot the ends of our thread 2 or 3 times to secure it. If you back stitch, it's going to get a little bulky and it won't look as nice. Next, we are going to just warm the top of the dart and then press it towards the center. By warming the top point of the dart, you get a nice flat dart pressed on the other side, and you won't get any wrinkles or puckers in your dart like you would if you were to start at the bottom. And that is what that looks like for now. And I have also gone ahead and done the darts on the front. So we've got 2 waist darts and 2 side darts, side bust darts. And we're going to press them now. So we want to press the darts here towards the bottom as well as towards the center of our bodice. And once that is done, I like to give it a good press on the right side as well. Now we can join them together at the shoulder seams and the side seams. So I am going to begin by placing my pins in here, and I am just placing them in along the shoulder seam. And then we are going to stitch that shoulder seam in place. And so just make sure that you backstitch, and with your 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, go ahead and stitch both of those shoulder seams here. And you do want to ensure that your fabric is right side together. And once that is done, we are just going to press that shoulder seam open. And that way everything lies nice and flat for you. And it is starting to come together, and it should look like this. Now we're going to do the back yoke detail. So with this, we are going to place the front and the back yoke detailing right sides together, and we're going to pin them at the shoulder seams. And once that is done, we are going to stitch it just like we did the actual shirt here. Now, once that is stitched and the seams are pressed open, the next thing that you need to do is press under the seam allowance of 5/8 of an inch along the bottom of that yoke. So I like to use this metal seam gauge just to get a really good press, and then I go back over with my steam in order to really set that in place. And so once we're done that, we are going to stitch that in place. And I'm actually stitching from the wrong side just because I can see exactly what is going on, because I want to make sure that my seam still maintains at 5/8 of an inch. So step 2, the waistband and the skirt. So as we head into step 2, it does make mention that you can use French seams for the remainder of some of the seam lines. Now, you can alternatively zigzag them or serge or overlock them to finish those edges, but it really gives a more professional result by doing the French seams. So I opted to show you how to do those French seams. That being said, our standard seam allowance is 5/8 of an inch or 1.6 centimeters. So we want to ensure that when we are stitching the first line of stitches, it comes in at 0.8 centimeters. So just be careful of where those seam allowances are, because if you adjust that, you are going to have a different fit than what was originally intended. Now, there is a decent amount of ease built into this shirt, so if your seam allowances are off just slightly and you make it a little bit smaller, it isn't too much to worry about. So we are going to do the French seam option, and we're going to start with the belt. So we are just placing this wrong sides together, and we are going to pin in place. And then I am just using my seam gauge to mark where I am going to be stitching. So I want half of that 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. So I'm going to adjust my needle until I get it to the 0.8 inches that I want to stitch at for my French seam. So I am just going to place it right here. And it is just slightly to the right of center, following the edge of my presser foot, if anybody is wondering. And then from there, I am going to mark out with my pin exactly where I want my seam allowance to be from the edge, because I don't want to change that. And I'm just marking on both sides of the fabric, so you can see I've got 2 little lines here, and that is going to help me out later on. Now, the next thing that we need to do is we need to trim down these seam allowances. So I am just using my rotary cutter, but you can just as easily trim it down with your tailor's shears. And once that is done, we need to press this. So you're going to start by pressing that seam down towards that waistband piece. And once that is done, we are going to fold it back in on itself, and we're going to place right along that seam line and give it a good press. And now our fabric should be right sides together. So I'm just going to flip it out, and you can see that I've got my wrong side facing up and it is right sides together. And I am just following along that line that I marked with chalk. I figured out where that was, and it turns out that I can stitch right along my presser foot, and it gives me the exact seam allowance I need. Next, we are going to press that seam allowance down and then top stitch it in place. So you can see that that's top stitched. And we're just going to place that down, and we're going to do the same for the front pieces as well. So you can see that I have pushed it down and top stitched it. Next, we're going to do the skirt. So we have 2 markings that mark the pleat for the skirt portion on the shirt. And you're just going to place a pin through those 2 notches, match them up, and then you want to stitch 5/8 of an inch down. And so I'm just marking that with chalk. That is my stop line. I'm going to stitch just that small little bit. So you can see right here that I have it stitched, and then we are going to press this pleat open and flat. So we're just going to open it up so that it hits the center of that seam line and give it a nice good press. And then we are going to baste along the top. Now we are going to attach that waistband piece to the bottom of the skirt. So I like to fold it in half so that I can find my exact center, which happens to also be where the pleat is. And now we're going to do the French seam version once again. So we're going to place them wrong sides together, and then we are just going to pin this together, matching up any of the notches, and stitch that in place on both sides as well as on the back. Now on the back, you can see that I've got 2 pleats going there. And then we are going to do the same thing we did for the top portion. We're going to press it up towards that waistband, and then we're going to fold it back in on itself so that it is right sides together, making sure that we are right along that seam, and don't forget to trim down your seam. And then we're going to stitch it in place and then press that seam back up towards that waistband and then top stitch it in place. And you will be done the waistband and skirt portion of our top. So once that has been all stitched together, it should look a little something like this, where we've got our front and our back. And now we can begin to work on these side seams. So with this, we are also going to do the French seam version, meaning we are going to start with our right sides facing out and the wrong sides facing together. So I am just pinning, going all the way down the side of my shirt on both sides, and then I'm going to stitch that. And then just like we have been doing, I am using my rotary cutter to trim down that seam allowance, popping over to our pressing station, and then I'm going to give it a nice good press. And then press it back in half so that now our right sides are facing together with the wrong sides facing out. Now I find with this fabric, it works really well with some steam, and then stitch that in place. And then you are going to want to give it another good press, and I am going to press this towards the back of my shirt. And we're going to repeat the exact same thing on the other side. And so now we have our finished seams there. So next we are just going to do the bottom, and I am going to stitch at 1/4 of an inch all along the bottom hem. Now the reason I do this is so that I get a perfect 1/4 inch hem all the way around and my fabric does not fray. This works so much better than using any sort of seam gauge, and I find it works really well with fiddly fabrics like silks and satins. And once I have that first layer pressed at 1/4 of an inch, I'm going to turn it up that exact same amount and give it a nice good press using a decent amount of steam from my iron to create the perfect 1/4 inch double folded hem. So once that is all done, I'm going to go ahead and top stitch this. Now I'm actually going to change my presser foot to this edge stitching foot, and instead of stitching on the right side, I'm going to stitch on the wrong side, and I'm going to place the blade of my edge stitching foot right along the fold and then adjust my needle to where I want it to stitch. This will have a absolutely perfect top stitched hem right along the edges with everything nice and even. Now on to step 3, the button placket. So with this, we have our button plackets. I am just using some Best Press, which is a starch alternative, just so I can get a nice crisp edge on this button placket. So we're going to fold it in half with wrong sides together, and then we are going to fold it once again with each corner going towards the inside, similar to how you would create a double fold bias tape. Once that is done, we are going to fold it back towards center, matching up both of those 2 folded edges. And give it a nice good press, and we're going to repeat that to the other side. And the next thing that we are going to do is attach this button placket. So the way in which we attach this, we are just going to open this all the way up, and we are going to match up the raw edges. And we're just going to place some pins in here, and we are going to pin this button placket going all the way down the shirt. So just continue going down, making sure that you unfold that button placket. And you will have some overhang, that is exactly what you need. Then we are going to stitch right along that folded edge. So put your needle down right in that crease that we have folded, and we are going to stitch along there. So don't forget to backstitch at the beginning and the end to secure your stitches, and then go ahead following that line there. The next thing we're going to do is we are going to press it into that button placket. Step 4, the collar. So we are going to take our collar pieces and we're going to place the under and over collar right sides together. And then we are going to go ahead and pin the perimeter of the collar along the curved edge as well as the outside of the collar, leaving that neck edge open. So you can see I've got my pins all in place, and then we are going to stitch all the way around. So I wanted to quickly show you how I go about stitching it. So we will stitch at 5/8 of an inch, which is our seam allowance. And as we come up to the corner, you are not going to pivot exactly at 90 degrees. In fact, we are going to lift our presser foot, and instead of going at 90 degrees, we are going to go at a kitty corner. And I'm going to take 2 stitches, and then I'm going to turn it 90 degrees and continue on my stitching. The reason you do this is you will get perfectly pointed corners without having corners that stick out just a little too far and your collar does not look good. So this is my trick to you on how to get those perfect collar points. So once again, we are going to turn our fabric so that it is just at an angle. So not at 90 degrees, but at a slight angle to that, and take 2 stitches and then turn and continue the rest of our collar here. So I hope that helped you out. And that's what it will look like. So you will see we have these little diagonal line here, and it has its slightly rounded appearance. Next, we are going to clip off those corners just to reduce some of that bulk along the points there. And then we are going to flip this collar right side out. And I'm just finger pressing it right now. And then I'm going to get my point turner and I'm going to go in to those collar points and really work those points out to make sure it's nice and crisp. And then of course, we need to take it over to the iron and press it. And this is where the magic happens with your collar, where it looks absolutely stunning. Make sure that you have everything all lined up perfectly. And this fabric really does press like a dream. Then I just top stitched around the outside of my collar. And now we are going to attach the collar to the shirt. So with right sides together, so the under collar is touching the right side of our shirt. That is how we are going to pin it up. And you can see the collar doesn't go right to the edge. That is exactly what we want. And then we're just going to stitch that in place. And once it has been stitched in place, we are going to fold that button placket over just along those same press lines that we had, and then back in on itself. So it's folded exactly how we had it before. I'm going to show you another close-up here where we put the collar down. We are going to fold the button placket right at that mark and then fold it back over itself. So we do have a little line there that denotes where we are going to fold it to, and then place a pin in there. And I'm just placing a couple pins just to secure it. And then what we're going to do is sandwich in the yoke. So this is the inside. So if you wanted to put a label in your shirt, you would place it on that yoke. And then I am going to place this right sides together. And I am just matching up those notches, which should match up with the shoulder seams on both your shirt and the yoke. Placing a couple of pins in there, and then I am going to go ahead and distribute the rest of the pins along the yoke, and then going along the top, extending over to where we have that button placket. And it should look like this, and then we are just going to stitch that in place. And once it has been stitched in place, we are going to go ahead and clip some small notches about an inch apart, not going through the stitching line, so that we can create a bit of ease along that neckline so it lies nice and flat. And this is what it will look like. And then we're going to use our point turner to really point out those edges at the top of the button placket. And so we're just going to turn that in. And the nice thing is, on the yoke, it just folds right inside that button placket, and then the folded edge covers that up, and when we top stitch it down, it is held nice and secure. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to give the collar and the yoke a nice good press so that everything is lying quite nicely. I also want to go down and right along the placket side. I want to give that a press as well because we will be top stitching this in place. So I'm going to really arrange that yoke nicely. So I am just placing it down, and then I am going to place the folded button placket right over that and give it another press just to make sure everything is sitting quite nicely. So I'm just fiddling around with that just slightly, and I am making sure that it lines up so that that folded edge is exactly where it needs to be from where we had originally pressed that. And I'm going to do the exact same thing on the other side. I'll give you a close-up look. I'm just placing that yoke inside here and then just giving it another good press. And going all the way down. And once that is all done, the next thing that we need to do is pin and place the bottom of the yoke. So I am just going to place this in, and so if you recall, we had folded under as well as top stitched this piece of the yoke. And then we need to hide that seam that we had before. So this is the reason why we didn't do a French seam, because we actually have an inside yoke to cover that seam. So we are going to place it so that it goes just over that seam line there. And then once it is pinned, we are going to stitch right across. So you can see that it also creates a nice set of top stitching on the right side as well. Now, the next part of this is going in and top stitching that button placket in place. And I am just going to match up that shoulder seam and put a pin in there. We're not necessarily stitching it quite yet. We are going to stitch along this bottom area that goes into the button placket on both sides of the front. And so just match up along here for your sleeve. You really want to do that to make sure that nothing is twisted when you top stitch this in place. And I'm really just pushing it out to make sure that my fabric, there isn't any extra fabric in there. And then just pinning this in place, and then we'll go ahead and top stitch that in place along both sides. And once that has been top stitched in place, so you can see it just like so, you can see a nice top stitching detail from the front. Then I'm going to go ahead and just along the sleeve portion where we have the yoke, I am just going to baste that together. Now you could use a basting stitch. I just used a regular stitch because it's going to get hidden anyway. So you're going to do that for both of the edges. Now I did end up cutting this down just slightly, as well as cutting a diagonal out of this to make it a little bit easier to turn. You don't have to do that, but I find it helps to reduce some of that bulk, and it gives a nice crisp point to it. And once we have folded that in, we are going to press the button placket once again. I know we've pressed this 3 times already, but hey, pressing helps your sewing to look a lot more polished. And then I'm going in with my pins, and I am working from the the right side of the garment. And I'm placing my pin along the edge where my needle is going to go, and then I'm going to check the back end just to make sure that I am going through that button placket on the back side as well. So you're going to continue doing that. And the reason why you do check that back side is so that you know when you are top stitching, you are always going to catch that back end of the button placket, and you won't have to unpick and re-stitch any areas of your button placket. Then you are going to stitch that in place, and you want to stitch just beyond where you had placed those pins. So I'm just going to show you here what that will look like. So I'm just going to place my needle down and do a back stitch, and then you can see my needle coming up towards where the needle is. My needle's here, and I'm just going to stitch right along that other side. This guarantees me that I'm always going to catch that back piece. And that is what it looks like from the back and the front. So now we need to add the buttons and buttonholes onto the placket of our shirt. Now, traditionally, ladies' buttons are on the left-hand side and the buttonholes are on the right, and men's shirt is the opposite of that. That being said, because it is a me-made garment, you can place your buttons and buttonholes on whichever side you feel most comfortable with. So with these button guide here, you can go ahead and add that in with your chalk, or if you have a button gauge, you can go ahead and divide that up just based on where you would like your buttons to lie. So I'm going to use my button gauge because that is what I am most familiar with, but that button placket guide does the exact same thing from your pattern. I like to do my buttons as an X so that I know exactly where my center is. That way I can easily attach those buttons and make sure that they are all exactly even and where they should be. And now I wanted to chat just a little bit about the side of the buttons. So for men's shirts, you typically have it on the left side as shown, and for women's shirts, you typically have it on the right side as shown, though totally up to you. So once you have that, I am going to stitch on my buttons. I'm stitching mine on by machine, but you can do it by hand. And then we're going to attach those buttonholes. So I'm just going to show you really quickly how I do my buttonholes. And this is a very common attachment that most domestic sewing machines have. Just set it to your buttonhole stitch, place your button in the back, and it automatically does the exact correct size for your button. Now, if you don't have this attachment, you can also do a very narrow zigzag in order to create that buttonhole. And that's what it will look like. Next, I am using my buttonhole chisel to cut out these buttonholes. I have used a seam ripper before and have cut through my fabric, so I am a little shy to use that. I do tend to prefer the chisel. So step 5 is the sleeves. If you're making the sleeveless version, this is where you will attach your bias binding and then just fold it back in on itself like so, and then top stitch all the way around, and you are done. But I am going to show you how to make the long sleeve version. So we are going to start with the sleeve placket. So with right sides together, just stitch that really short end and then make a little point at the top. Go ahead and press that down and then press each of the sides in towards the center. Now this is a very small and fiddly piece, so it can be a little tricky to maneuver, but if you go slow, you are bound to get this right. So you are going to then place this onto your sleeve, and I am just going to mark a line going right down the center of this placket here, just so that I have a nice guideline. And then we are going to place this on the right side of our fabric, and we are just going to place it right along that line that we had drawn from the pattern marking, and then make sure to mark the end of that line where that line ended from the pattern markings. I am pinning both sides because both sides need to be folded downwards. And then we are going to stitch along that line in a small little rectangle. When you get up to the top, you are just going to put your needle down, you're going to pivot, and then you're going to take 2 stitches, no more than 2, and then you're going to go back down following that line. And that will give you just enough room to get your scissors or your rotary blade in to cut this. And you can see here, I'm going to use my scissors because I'm a bit more precise with that. And I'm stitching between those 2 stitch lines. Do not cut through them. And then we are going to flip it to the wrong side, and then we are going to take that button placket, and similar to a welt pocket, if you have ever made that, we are going to flip this to the wrong side here. Now, this is something that you could not do without your iron and a decent amount of steam. So I am just folding this to the wrong side here, maintaining that one folded edge. I'm doing the one side, and then I am going to flip over and do the other side. Just coming in here, and then get the top, and then I am just straightening this up because I want the point to be nice because we will be top stitching this. So I'm just like fiddling around with it a little bit and then giving it a nice good press. And then we're going to top stitch around the edge here. So it should look like this with some nice top stitching along the edges. So next up we have our cuffs. So we're going to place them right sides together, and we are going to stitch around all of the edges except for one long edge. Then we are going to go ahead and clip those corners to reduce some of that bulk. Once that is done, we are going to turn this right side out, and of course we need that point turner to get a nice pointy cuff on there. The next thing you're going to do is press this so that we have a nice crisp cuff, and make sure to roll that fabric to make sure that everything is nice and even along that seam line, and I like to press both the right and the wrong side. So next up, we are going to fold this, and I find it's easier to fold the interfaced piece first because it is a wee bit thicker. So we're going to fold that in along our seam allowance, which is that 5/8 of an inch. And then we're going to fold the top part up to match the bottom portion. And just press that in place, and you're going to do that for both of the cuffs. And once that is done, we are going to take the cuff portion here, and I have stitched 2 layers of gathering stitches along the cuff. And next we are going to do French seams. So we are going to place these wrong sides together on our sleeve, and we are going to stitch the sleeve seam. So I'm just pinning this in place. It's a nice simple seam. Make sure you don't catch those threads that you use to gather in the seam. Flip it right side out, and then give it a press. Don't forget to trim those seam allowances so they don't get caught. And now your sleeve will be right sides together. And just press going all the way down, and then stitch once more along here to finish our French seam. And once that is done, get out your sleeve board, and then we are going to press this seam flat. And I like to press my seam towards the back of my sleeve. That is just my personal preference. And so I'm making sure that our seam is pressed towards the back. And now we can go ahead and attach the cuff portion along here. So with that, I am just marking my center of my sleeve before I gather anything, as well as the center of the cuff. This is going to ensure that the gathers that I place on the sleeve are going to be evenly distributed. So then I'm going to start to gather it just a little bit with those 2 bobbin threads that I had used with a long stitch length to create those gathers. And then I am going to open up my cuff, and I'm going to place the one edge in on one side. And I am going to pin that in place. And my next mark is going to be the center mark. And I'm going to pin that in place. So all 3 layers I am pinning through, and then the edge, and pin that in place. And then now I can go ahead and distribute some of that ruffle, and my one kind of came out. So make sure you put it down far enough that it is not going to come out. And then you can see me pulling on some of the threads every once in a while, just to make sure that I've got everything all nicely distributed, and I'm adding in some extra pins. And then we can go ahead and from the right side, top stitch. So in order to do that, I am going to take my pins and I am going to place it in where I'm going to stitch, and then I am going to double check on the back to make sure it's going through that cuff. And if it is, it's good. If not, I reposition that pin. And then I can go ahead and do that all the way across along here. And then I can go ahead and pull out all of those pins along the wrong side of the cuff. And then we can go ahead on the top and stitch that in place. And we have going to go around the cuff as well along the sides and the bottom. And you have your perfect cuff. So for this, between the single and the double notch, we are going to do 2 rows of gathering stitches using a long stitch length. Don't backstitch. Next, we are going to place the sleeve right sides together with the shirt, matching up the double and single notches. So match the double notch to the double notch in the back of the shirt and the single notch to the single notch in the front of the shirt. First, I like to match up the sleeve as well as the underarm seam and the shoulder seam, and then I will match up the single and double notches and then go ahead and distribute the pins as well as pulling in some of that extra gathering using those stitches that help to ease that sleeve in. It also creates a nice amount of movement with that. And then stitch all the way around. You're going to do the same thing for the other sleeve, just like so. And if you want, you can go ahead and serge around, which is what I did. Now, if you did do that, you need to finish off those tails. You cannot just clip them away. So leave a bit of a tail. And then if you hold the thread in your finger and then push the needle down, you're going to get it through first time, every time. Then go back through your stitches with your needle here. And now you can clip those tails. This way your serging is not going to unravel. Now this pattern doesn't specify where you're to place the buttons and the buttonhole on the cuffs of your shirt. And so it is just standard practice to place the button on the bottom and the buttonhole along the top, or the one that is facing away from your body is where the buttonhole goes. So if you look at my cuff here, you can see that I have away from my body is where the buttonhole is on either side. So I have just put the buttonhole in as well as the button to finish up our shirt right here. And now for the reveal.
Let it go, what's the use in holding on? Can we find a way where we could spend some time alone? You know where to find me, you know which way to go. As long as you love me, we'll be singing all night long. So take a minute to hold me, I want nothing more.
So we are all done our Bruyere shirt. And I would classify this pattern as an intermediate because there are a couple more advanced techniques than a beginner pattern, such as inserting a collar, the button placket, as well as those teeny tiny sleeve plackets with those very narrow seam allowances and having to turn those out. That being said, if you're an adventurous beginner, I don't think you'll have any issues. But if you do come across any problems, or if you have any comments, do leave them in the comment section down below and we'll be sure to get back to you as soon as we're able. Now, as I had mentioned before, you can follow a lot of our hashtags here on Minerva, and one of them is hashtag Minerva TV and hashtag sewalong. These are great to follow for tutorials just like this. And if you follow hashtag Minerva Kits, you'll be the first to know when we release any new kits. Now, if you haven't done so already, consider creating a profile here on Minerva and following us so that you can see all of our new fabrics as well as feature patterns and sew-alongs that we have for you. Now, if you would like to follow me personally here on Minerva, I'm over at Sheer Stitchery and I will leave that linked below. And if you're interested in grabbing this kit or the pattern yourself, I will leave the link to everything down below. Until next time, makers.